As I was listening to the presentations back in what they call the green room, I was trying to figure out how I could possibly measure up, and decided. I was reminded actually of something that happened in a courtroom in Dallas many years ago, about 50 years ago. In the old days, there was no maximum sentence that a jury could impose for murder in something other than a death penalty case. And so what happened in those days before the penal code was modified was that there were some really crazy things that juries did. And there was one case back in the 1960s in which a jury came back with a verdict, a sentence of 5,000 years. And this really did happen. And when the time came for the defendant to be sentenced, the judge called the defendant before the bench, and he said to the defendant, "Is there anything that you want to say before I sentence you?" And the defendant looked up at him and said, "Judge, there is no way that I can serve 5,000 years. I just can't make it." And the judge looked back at him and said, "Well, just do the best you can." So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm not going to sing. I can't dance. I don't have a slideshow or a multimedia presentation. I don't even have any new ideas. I've listened to refreshing talks, uplifting talks. What I'm going to talk to you about today is anything but uplifting. It's the death penalty. And those of you that remember the days when I was district attorney will remember that I was no wild-eyed, pointy-headed liberal social scientist type. When I was your district attorney 25 years ago, I prosecuted death penalty cases, and I compiled a perfect record. Every person that I charged with capital murder was convicted, and each of those men has been executed in your name by the state of Texas. I say these things not to brag, but to make a point. And the point is that I have done more than just talk the talk on this issue. I have walked the walk. I have lived in the belly of the beast. I was, for most of my adult life, an outspoken supporter of the death penalty. But in 2005, as you know from the program, the Houston Chronicle called me and told me that they had looked at one of my cases, the Ruben Cantu case, and their conclusion was that Ruben Cantu was innocent. When I reviewed the case, I was unable to determine that he was innocent, but I was shocked by what I saw. When I looked at the case, I realized that I had made a horrible mistake in judgment. I had prosecuted a young man and sought the death penalty on the basis of the testimony of a single eyewitness. I said earlier that I wasn't going to brag, or I wasn't bragging, but in the old days when I was DA, I did do a lot of bragging, and one of the things that I bragged about was the fact that I was the youngest major metropolitan district attorney in the United States. I was when I took office, and when I left office, I was still the youngest. And I was always proud of that. But when I looked at the Cantu case, the thing that I realized was that one of the criticisms that had been lodged against me was that I was too young to be DA. And the thing that I realized when I looked at that case was that at least in that context, those critics were correct, because what I didn't know at that point, because I hadn't tried enough cases, was that eyewitness testimony is not always reliable. We had a brutal crime. We had no physical evidence. We had no gun, no confession, but we had a compelling eyewitness. He was the survivor of the attack, and he survived 9 bullet wounds. And we believed what he told us. He fingered Cantu. Cantu was convicted. He was sentenced to die in 1985, and he was executed in 1993, and nobody thought about him again until 2005, when the Houston Chronicle started turning rocks over. And what they found when they started turning rocks over was that our eyewitness was willing at that point to recant his trial testimony, and he did. And he didn't have anything to gain by doing it. He wasn't writing a book or anything like that. He recanted his trial testimony. I would love to be able to tell you that I am the only former elected prosecutor in the country who finds himself in the position of having to admit an error in judgment that may have led to the execution of an innocent man. But I know that I'm not. I know that there are others. And because I know better than anybody in this community that it's the prosecution that drives the criminal justice system, I believe that prosecutors whose best efforts produce unfortunate results in capital murder cases have a moral obligation to accept responsibility for their mistakes. It was difficult for me to do that, but I did, and I assumed personal responsibility for Cantu's execution. Now, those of you that are out there, I see some old heads, some folks that were around when I was DA, and I'll bet you that those of you who were around and who remember what it was like never imagined in your wildest dreams that you would ever hear me say something like this. Well, I'm here to tell you that I am in this fight to end the death penalty in America, money, marbles, and chalk. And I will be in this fight. And I will be in this fight until we either get rid of it or until the last dog dies. That's what I'm going to do. You know, I want to share with you, the Cantu experience was an experience that changed my life. But I had an experience this past summer that changed my life again that I want to share with you briefly. Before I do, I have to tell you about a conversation that I had at the end of an incredible weekend. I was getting ready to get on an airplane in Philadelphia, and there was a cheeky woman standing in front of me, and she turned to me. We were trying to clear security, airport security. She turned to me and she said, "Do you see all these people? I promise you that none of these people have had a weekend that was as interesting as mine." And you know, when I'm going through airport security, I'm always a little grumpy by the time I get to the people that count, because I've never been able to figure out how it is that we're safer because we take our shoes off. And so I'm working real hard not to get into arguments with people when I'm going through security. But I couldn't resist the temptation this day. I turned to this woman, I smiled at her, and I said, "Ma'am, I don't have any idea what you did this weekend, but I promise you that whatever it wasn't as interesting as what I did." And the reason why I say that is that I had spent the most profoundly moving weekend of my life with 15 men who have three things in common with each other. The first thing that they have in common with each other is that they had all been convicted of capital murder. The second thing that they had in common with each other is that each of them had spent years and years, in some cases more than 20 years, on death row. And the third thing that they had in common with each other was that each of them was innocent. And each of them had been factually exonerated and released. And I spent the entire weekend with these men staring into the living faces of the death penalty. I listened to their stories. I heard David Keaton, who was the first of the 140 men in America who have been factually exonerated and removed from death row. I listened to David Keaton talk about what it's like to be confined for years, alone, 23 hours a day, in a 6-foot by 9-foot cell, waiting to die for a crime that somebody else committed. I listened to Kurt Bloodsworth talk about the fact that for years and years he was called that monster, first by prosecutors and then by the people that he was on death row with in Maryland. There's a food chain on death row too, and they called him that monster. He told me what it's like to be stripped of every vestige of human dignity, day after day, year after year, and then to be released and expected to function normally in the community. I talked to Delbert Tibbs about what it's like to try to get a job after you've been on death row, what it's like to be told over and over and over again what you or I would say because of the questions that exist even when innocence has been established. I listened to Randy Steidle talk about what it's like to try to reestablish stable relationships, what it's like to try to regain the ability to trust another human being. I shared a room that weekend with Rolando Cruz. Rolando Cruz is an unbridled force of nature. He is an explosive personality with a towering intellect. He's the kind of person who if he'd gotten an MBA 20 years ago, he would be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company today. But he didn't. He lived in the projects. But because of his charisma, he rose in his food chain, and he became the charismatic, the undisputed leader of one of the most notorious gangs in Chicago. I shared a room with this guy, and he's a wonderful human being. He's a single parent today. He raises his 3 daughters quietly in Wisconsin. But during the bad time, part of the problem was that he was smarter than the cops, and he freely admits that he was no saint back in the old days, back in the 1980s. But the cops decided that they were going to get even with him, and what they did is they framed him for the rape and murder of a little girl in 1983. No dispute about whether he was framed. He was tried 3 times. He spent 12 years on death row until he was finally released. The person who committed the crime admitted guilt in 1985, but Rolando was not released until 1993 when DNA evidence established conclusively that he was innocent. Now, in the aftermath of his exoneration, the reason why I say with certainty that he was framed, 7 police officers and prosecutors were indicted for fabricating evidence and suborning perjured testimony from 6 jailhouse witnesses who testified against Rolando. I heard his tortured voice, a voice that spoke of a criminal justice system that undermined the promise that our courts will guarantee the protection of the innocent. As I was walking away from my conversation with Rolando, trying to process what I'd heard, I came upon Randy Steidle. He was sitting in the dark on a bench and he was crying, and he was embarrassed when he saw me. I probably shouldn't have walked up to him, but I'm glad that I did because we talked and he told me about his case. He told me what it was like to be within hours of execution twice, not once, twice, to have his head shaved. He told me what it was like to stuff paper in his ears so that the roaches would be kept out. He told me what it was like to live through death, to be on death row when the flood came, and to be returned to his prison cell and to have to sleep on a moldy mattress that was caked with mud. Randy, if Randy walked in here right now and sat in one of these seats, you'd think that he was a successful local businessman. If you talked to him, you'd find him pleasant, bright, articulate. He's the kind of guy that you'd have over for dinner on Friday night. A really, really wonderful, decent human being. He made the mistake of doing his civic duty. He reported what he believed was police corruption to the authorities in the small town in Illinois where he lived. About the same time, Karen Rhodes became frightened when she saw her boss putting automatic weapons and bags of money in his car. What she didn't know and what Randy didn't know was that the mob was laundering drug money through pizza parlors in small towns in Illinois. What Karen didn't know was that her boss was the target of an undercover investigation. Within days of what Karen saw and Randy's complaint, Karen and her husband were dead. They had been stabbed to death. Their house had been burned to the ground. And Randy was fighting for his life because the corrupt police officers that he had complained about were doing their best to pin the killings on him. Randy spent 17 years on death row. He was released in 2005. The testimony against him at his trial came from a drug addict with a mental history and the town drunk. They testified against him, and then they recanted their testimony, and then they recanted the recantations, and then they recanted the recantations of the recantations. And all through this process, when it was absolutely clear to everybody that Randy was innocent, he was still on death row. And he was there until it was finally established conclusively that the knife that was at the center of the case, the prosecution's case, could not have been the murder weapon. I met the Black Gandhi. Okay. I met the Black Gandhi. Delbert Tibbs is a serene mountain of a man, 6 feet 3 inches tall, light complexion, a black man, clear complexion, light skin. He made the mistake in the 1970s of dropping out of the seminary to walk across America to try to find himself. But he made the second mistake of walking across Mississippi when he was doing that. And he walked across Mississippi when Cynthia Nadeau was murdered 220 miles away in Florida by a man, or she was raped, her boyfriend was murdered. Cynthia described her attacker as a black man with dark skin who was 5 feet 6 inches tall and who had a severely pockmarked complexion. No way that these were the same people. But Delbert was convicted by an all-white jury. Delbert was never able to get a job after that. And so today he writes poetry in Chicago. And he's somebody that I am very proud to call my friend. There are more than 3,000 people on death row today in America, somewhere. The men that I spent my weekend with are the lucky ones. They're the ones that give new meaning to John Bradford's famous statement, "There but for the grace of God go I." What opponents of the death penalty seek today is not for the horrible criminals that are on death row waiting to die. It's for those among them who are innocent. It is also for the millions of Americans who pay their taxes and who remember the promise that we made to each other so long ago when we gave the government this awesome power. And that promise was that our courts will guarantee the protection of the innocent. Anyone who has the opportunity to know just one of these men will recognize that this is a fight that has to be won, that we are being tested as a people, and that whether we pass this test or not will say a great deal more about us than it does the wretched creatures who commit crimes in our communities. We are being tested. And what I would leave with you is the challenge, and that challenge is that we do everything in our power in this generation to make sure that we have the opportunity and that we take advantage of the opportunity to pass the test that we have been charged with, and that we also remember that test is whether we will keep the promise or not, whether our generation will keep the promise. We can't fail. Thank you.